In the early hours of December 11th, 2025, inside the walls of Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, a quiet and tightly controlled procedure brought an end to a case that had stretched across generations. Harold Wayne Nichols, a man who had spent more than 3.5 decades on death row, was pronounced dead following a lethal injection carried out by the state. There were no crowds inside the execution chamber, no raised voices, and no dramatic spectacle. Only witnesses, officials, and a moment that closed a chapter begun in the late 1980s. For some, it was the final step in a long-awaited process of justice. For others, it was a troubling reminder of how slowly and deliberately the machinery of capital punishment moves in the United States. Nichols' execution did not arrive suddenly. It followed years of court hearings, appeals, postponements, and legal challenges that spanned multiple governors, shifting laws, and changing public attitudes toward the death penalty. The crime that led to this moment occurred decades earlier, long before smartphones, social media, or 24-hour news cycles shaped public memory. In 1988, a young college student named Karen Pulley lost her life in Chattanooga, Tennessee. What followed was an investigation that would eventually lead authorities to Harold Wayne Nichols, setting in motion a legal journey that would last longer than many entire lifetimes. Over the years, Nichols became one of Tennessee's longest-serving death row inmates. His name surfaced repeatedly in court records, legal briefs, and news reports, often in connection with broader debates about capital punishment, execution methods, and the ethics of delayed justice. His case raised difficult questions. What does justice mean when it takes decades to carry out a sentence? Does time change responsibility, punishment, or accountability? And how do victims' families, defendants, and society at large carry the weight of such prolonged legal battles? On the night of his execution, outside the prison walls, emotions ran in different directions. Some people gathered to protest the death penalty, holding signs and candles in the darkness. Others waited quietly for confirmation that the sentence had finally been carried out, hoping it would bring a sense of closure that had been denied for years. News outlets reported the outcome in brief headlines, while the deeper story, one shaped by law, human choices, and systemic delay, remained largely untold. This documentary explores that deeper story. It traces the life of Harold Wayne Nichols, the crime that altered multiple lives forever, and the legal process that followed him for more than 35 years. It examines how one case became part of a much larger conversation about justice in America and what lessons can be drawn from a system that moves slowly but carries irreversible consequences. This is not a story told to shock or sensationalize. It is a story about time, accountability, and the lasting impact of decisions made by individuals and institutions alike. To understand how it ended in an execution chamber in 2025, we must go back to where it all began. To understand how Harold Wayne Nichols became one of Tennessee's longest-serving death row inmates, we need to look back at the early years of his life. This isn't to excuse what he would later do, but to place his story within a broader human and social context. Harold Wayne Nichols was born on the very last day of 1960 in Cleveland, Tennessee, a small city in the southeastern part of the state. Public records and court documents offer limited details about his childhood. This is a common reality in criminal cases, where someone's early life is often pieced together years later through testimonies, evaluations, and fragmented accounts. What we do know is that Nichols grew up in a working-class environment, typical for many families in that region during that time. His upbringing was shaped by the economic pressures and social norms of the late 20th century American South. People who later spoke about Nichols described him as someone who didn't immediately stand out as dangerous or violent in his early adult years. He held jobs, he interacted with others in his community, and eventually, he became a husband and a father. From the outside, his life appeared ordinary. This is an important reminder that many individuals who later commit serious crimes don't start their lives visibly marked for such a dark future. As Nichols entered adulthood in the 1980s, Tennessee, like much of the United States, was grappling with rising concerns about violent crime. The criminal justice system during this era heavily emphasized tough sentencing, and public support for capital punishment was significantly higher than it would be decades later. These broader social attitudes would eventually influence how crimes like his were prosecuted and punished. Court records indicate that Nichols struggled with behavioral and psychological issues that became more apparent over time. During later legal proceedings, his defense attorneys would reference aspects of his mental health and personal history in an attempt to provide context for his actions. Psychological evaluations introduced during his sentencing described a deeply troubled individual, though not someone who was deemed legally insane under Tennessee law. Nichols' personal relationships also became part of the court narrative. He had family members who continued to acknowledge his existence even after his conviction, though their voices were often overshadowed by the severity of his crimes and the public's focus on punishment. Letters and testimony presented during later clemency efforts described a man who, over decades of incarceration, showed signs of remorse and personal reflection. These accounts, however, came long after the harm had been done. It's important to understand that early background information in capital cases serves a specific legal purpose. In sentencing hearings, juries are asked not only to consider the crime itself, but also the life of the defendant. This process reflects a central tension in the justice system, balancing accountability for irreversible harm with the recognition of the human life standing before the court. By the late 1980s, Nichols' life would take a dramatic and irreversible turn. Whatever challenges or circumstances had shaped his early years, they would soon be eclipsed by events that brought intense scrutiny from law enforcement, the courts, and the public. Once those events unfolded, the name Harold Wayne Nichols would become permanently associated with one of the most serious crimes under Tennessee law. Looking back, Nichols' early life doesn't provide simple answers. It doesn't offer a clear explanation or a single moment where everything changed. Instead, it reflects a broader truth often seen in criminal cases. Lives are shaped by many factors over time, and the path to tragedy is rarely defined by a single moment or decision. As this story moves forward, the focus shifts away from his background and toward his actions, toward a crime that would devastate a family, shock a community, and begin a legal process that would last for more than 35 years. The ordinary details of Nichols' early life would soon be replaced by court filings, investigations, and a sentence that would follow him until his final day. By the late 1980s, Harold Wayne Nichols' life had already taken on a trajectory that would draw intense attention from law enforcement and the courts. While his early years had appeared largely unremarkable, the events of 1988 and 1989 would redefine his public identity and set in motion a legal process that would stretch for decades. The case that would define Nichols' life in the public record began in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with the disappearance of 20-year-old college student Karen Pulley, who attended Chattanooga State University. Her absence immediately alarmed friends, family, and the local community, prompting a full-scale police investigation. Public reports at the time highlighted the urgency of the case and the determination of law enforcement officials to locate her and bring those responsible to justice. Investigators worked meticulously, examining possible witnesses, reviewing timelines, and piecing together a series of leads that gradually narrowed the field of suspects. Through a combination of interviews, background checks, and physical evidence, law enforcement ultimately connected Nichols to the case. He was identified as a person of interest, and his movements and associations were scrutinized in detail. Nichols was arrested on January 5, 1989, in connection with Pulley's death. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence linking him to the crime, which, when combined with his own statements to investigators, led to a formal indictment. According to court records, Nichols later provided a videotaped confession detailing his involvement. He also admitted to other sexual assaults that had occurred in the Chattanooga area during the same time period, establishing a pattern that law enforcement cited in both the investigation and later in court proceedings. The investigation itself reflected the state of criminal justice procedures in late 1980s Tennessee. Without the benefit of today's advanced forensic technologies, investigators relied on a combination of interviews, confessions, and circumstantial evidence to build their case. Nichols' cooperation during questioning, including the admissions he made, became a key element in moving the legal process forward. The formal charges filed against Nichols were severe. They included felony murder and aggravated rape, along with other counts connected to prior assaults. Each of these charges carried significant legal weight under Tennessee law, and together they represented a serious threat of long-term incarceration or capital punishment. Public statements at the time from prosecutors emphasized the gravity of the offenses and the need for the full measure of the law to be applied. The investigation also revealed the broader social context in which these crimes occurred. In the late 1980s, communities across the United States were becoming increasingly aware of violent crime and the impact on victims and families. Cases like Nichols highlighted the need for both swift investigative work and careful legal procedure to ensure justice while protecting the rights of all parties involved. As the legal process advanced from investigation to indictment, Nichols became the focus of intense public scrutiny. Media coverage, though restrained compared with today's digital environment, reported on the case with a focus on the procedural and human dimensions, balancing the need to inform the public with sensitivity toward the victims. Ultimately, the investigation into Nichols' actions laid the groundwork for one of Tennessee's longest-running capital cases. It was not merely the crime itself, but the thoroughness and complexity of the investigative process, combined with the legal challenges that would follow, that ensured Nichols' story would remain in the public record for decades. This chapter of Nichols' life represents the transition from ordinary adulthood to a world defined by legal consequences. The investigation established the foundation for the trial, the appeals, and the eventual execution, highlighting how law enforcement, legal systems, and communities interact in the face of serious crime. It also underscores the lasting impact on those affected, particularly the family of Karen Pulley, whose loss would resonate for decades. As we move into the next chapter, the focus shifts from investigation to the courtroom, where Nichols' fate was formally decided and a process of justice, long, complex, and often delayed, would begin in earnest. By 1990, the case against Harold Wayne Nichols had moved from investigation to the courtroom, where the focus shifted from determining what had happened to deciding how the justice system would respond. The trial phase represented a critical turning point, not only for Nichols, but also for the family of Karen Pulley and for a community seeking resolution after years of uncertainty. Rather than proceeding through a lengthy jury trial on guilt, Nichols entered guilty pleas to the charges related to the death of Karen Pulley and to multiple counts connected to sexual assaults in the Chattanooga area. This decision removed any doubt about responsibility in the eyes of the court and placed the emphasis squarely on sentencing. In capital cases, this distinction is crucial. Even when guilt is established, the question of punishment remains a separate and complex legal process. The sentencing phase unfolded before a jury tasked with one of the most serious decisions under American law: whether Nichols should be sentenced to life imprisonment or to death. Prosecutors argued that the circumstances of the crime, combined with Nichols' admissions to additional violent offenses, met the legal standards for capital punishment under Tennessee law. They presented aggravating factors intended to demonstrate that the crime was severe enough to warrant the death penalty. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to present a fuller picture of Nichols as a person, not to deny the harm caused, but to argue for mercy. Attorneys introduced evidence related to his background, personal history, and psychological evaluations. Witnesses testified about aspects of his upbringing and behavior, and mental health professionals provided assessments intended to explain, though not excuse, his actions. This phase illustrated one of the most difficult tensions in the justice system, weighing the gravity of the crime against the humanity of the person who committed it. Jurors were instructed to carefully consider both sides. Under Tennessee law, a death sentence could only be imposed if the jury unanimously agreed that the aggravating factors outweighed any mitigating circumstances. This legal safeguard is designed to ensure that capital punishment is applied only in cases meeting the strictest criteria. After deliberation, the jury returned its decision. Harold Wayne Nichols was sentenced to death. The ruling placed him among a small group of inmates facing execution and marked the beginning of what would become an extraordinarily long period on death row. For the Pulley family, the sentence represented a formal acknowledgement of the loss they had suffered, though it did not erase the pain or bring immediate closure. The sentencing also reflected the broader climate of the early 1990s, a period when public support for the death penalty was at one of its highest points in modern American history. Legislators, prosecutors, and juries across the country often favored harsh penalties for violent crimes, believing them to be necessary for justice and deterrence. Nichols' sentence must be understood within this historical context, shaped by the laws and social attitudes of the time. Once the sentence was imposed, Nichols was transferred to death row, entering a highly restricted environment designed for inmates awaiting execution. From that moment forward, his life would be governed by schedules, procedures, and legal filings rather than personal choice. The courtroom decision did not end the case. Instead, it began a new phase defined by appeals, reviews, and repeated examinations of the same facts through different legal lenses. The trial and sentencing phase solidified Nichols' place in Tennessee's legal history. It transformed him from a defendant into a condemned inmate and set the stage for decades of legal challenges. What seemed, in 1990, like a definitive conclusion would instead become the starting point of a prolonged legal journey, one that would raise difficult questions about time, punishment, and the meaning of justice itself. As the story moves forward, attention shifts away from the courtroom verdict and toward what happened next: years of appeals, delays, and debates that kept the case alive long after many expected it to be over. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more deep dives into complex cases like this one. With the death sentence imposed, Harold Wayne Nichols entered a phase of the legal process that is often invisible to the public but central to the American justice system: the appeals process. For many capital cases, this stage lasts far longer than the trial itself, involving layers of review designed to ensure that convictions and sentences meet constitutional standards. In Nichols' case, this process would extend for more than 3 decades. Almost immediately after sentencing, Nichols' legal team began filing appeals in Tennessee state courts. These appeals examined every aspect of the case, from the legality of the sentencing procedure to the effectiveness of legal counsel. Courts reviewed whether Nichols' guilty pleas had been entered knowingly and voluntarily, whether the jury had been properly instructed, and whether the aggravating factors used to justify the death sentence met legal requirements. Each review followed formal procedures, often taking years to complete. As state appeals were exhausted, Nichols' case moved into the federal court system. Federal habeas corpus petitions challenged the constitutionality of his conviction and sentence, raising questions about due process and the application of capital punishment laws. These filings required judges to re-examine the case record in detail, sometimes decades after the original proceedings. While most of Nichols' appeals were ultimately denied, the process itself reflected the system's emphasis on caution in cases involving irreversible punishment. Over time, Nichols' execution was scheduled and postponed multiple times. Legal challenges, administrative issues, and broader state actions contributed to these delays. At various points, Tennessee paused executions statewide to review its lethal injection protocols, citing concerns about transparency and compliance with legal standards. Nichols' attorneys argued that the state's methods and secrecy surrounding execution drugs violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. One of the most significant delays occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, when planned executions were postponed due to public health concerns and logistical complications. This period further extended Nichols' time on death row, adding years to a sentence that had already far exceeded the average length of capital incarceration in the United States. In addition to court appeals, Nichols sought executive clemency, a process that allows a governor to commute a death sentence to life imprisonment. Clemency petitions often focus on factors such as acceptance of responsibility, behavior during incarceration, and evidence of remorse. Supporters of Nichols pointed to his decades-long record in prison and statements expressing regret for his actions. Opponents argued that the severity of the crime and the suffering of the victim's family outweighed these considerations. After reviewing the petition, Tennessee's governor declined to grant clemency. The decision reaffirmed the original sentence and cleared the way for the execution to proceed. For the Pulley family, the denial represented a long-awaited step toward finality, though it came after years of legal uncertainty and emotional strain. Throughout this period, Nichols lived under the unique conditions of death row. His days were structured, highly restricted, and marked by the knowledge that his sentence could be carried out at any time once appeals were exhausted. Letters, limited visits, and legal correspondence became his primary connections to the outside world. Over the decades, his case became a reference point in discussions about the length and cost of capital punishment appeals. The extended timeline of Nichols' case illustrates both the strengths and criticisms of the American death penalty system. Supporters argue that lengthy appeals are necessary safeguards against wrongful execution. Critics contend that decades of delay undermine justice for victims, families, and place an emotional burden on all involved. Nichols' case embodied this debate, demonstrating how the system's careful checks can also lead to prolonged uncertainty. By the time all legal avenues had been exhausted, Nichols had spent more than 35 years awaiting execution. What began as a swift sentence in 1990 had transformed into one of Tennessee's longest-running capital cases. The final phase was approaching, bringing with it renewed public attention, legal scrutiny, and reflection on a system that moves deliberately when life itself is at stake. The next chapter marks the conclusion of this long journey, an execution that closed one legal case while reopening broader questions about punishment, closure, and the legacy left behind. In the early hours of December 11th, 2025, more than 35 years after he was sentenced to death, Harold Wayne Nichols' legal journey reached its conclusion. At the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, state officials carried out his execution by lethal injection. Nichols was 64 years old, making him one of the longest-serving death row inmates ever executed in the state. The execution followed a tightly regulated protocol. Witnesses included prison officials, members of the media, and representatives connected to the case, including individuals associated with the victim's family. According to official reports, the procedure proceeded without disruption, and Nichols was pronounced dead shortly after the administration of the lethal injection. With that declaration, a case that had spanned nearly 4 decades was formally closed under the law. In his final statement, Nichols expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged the harm he had caused. He offered words directed at the family of Karen Pulley and spoke of love for his own family. Such statements, while brief, reflected a moment of reflection at the end of a long period of incarceration. For some observers, these words were seen as an expression of accountability. For others, they could not alter the irreversible damage done decades earlier. Outside the prison walls, reactions unfolded in parallel. Members of the victim's family released statements emphasizing the enduring pain caused by Karen Pulley's death and the emotional toll of waiting so many years for the sentence to be carried out. Some expressed hope that the execution would finally bring a measure of closure, while also acknowledging that no legal outcome could truly restore what had been lost. At the same time, death penalty opponents gathered to protest, holding signs and candles in quiet vigils. Their presence underscored the continuing national debate surrounding capital punishment, one that questions not only the morality of executions, but also their effectiveness, fairness, and emotional impact. Nichols' execution became part of this broader conversation, cited by advocates on both sides as evidence supporting their views. News coverage of the execution spread quickly across local and national outlets. While the headlines focused on the finality of the event, many reports also highlighted the extraordinary length of time Nichols spent on death row. Legal scholars and commentators noted that his case illustrated the complexities of capital punishment in modern America, where sentences can remain unresolved for decades due to appeals, procedural safeguards, and policy changes. The societal response reflected a country divided. For some, the execution reaffirmed the principle that the most serious crimes warrant the most severe penalties, regardless of how long it takes to enforce them. For others, the delay raised troubling questions about efficiency, cost, and the human consequences of prolonged incarceration under a death sentence. Nichols' case also prompted reflection on the purpose of punishment itself. Does justice lose meaning when it is delayed for decades? Does time change responsibility or accountability? And how should a legal system balance the rights of defendants with the needs of victims, families for resolution? These questions do not have simple answers, but they remain central to discussions about the future of the death penalty. In the end, the execution of Harold Wayne Nichols closed a single legal file, but it did not end the conversation. His story continues to be cited in debates about criminal justice reform, execution methods, and the emotional cost of capital punishment. For the Pulley family, it marked the end of a long and painful chapter. For society, it served as a reminder that the justice system, while designed to deliver accountability, also reflects the values and conflicts of the time in which it operates. The story of Harold Wayne Nichols is ultimately not just about one man or one crime. It is about a system that moves carefully when life is at stake, about the weight of irreversible decisions, and about the lasting impact of violence on individuals, families, and communities. As this chapter closes, the broader questions it raises remain, challenging us to consider what justice truly means and how it should be carried out in a society still searching for balance between punishment, responsibility, and humanity.